Smart contracts. I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot, but
Yeah.
do you think people really understand what they are?
I think a lot of people have heard the term, but maybe don't really understand how they work or even,
Yeah,
what their potential is.
totally. And, we talk a lot on this show about blockchain technology, but
Right.
this is kind of our deep dive into smart contracts
Exactly.
specifically. And we've got this great excerpt that we're going to be looking at today called What is a Dmart Contract in Blockchain?
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be a good one because it really breaks it down into something that's understandable.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess the first thing is just what is a smart contract? How would you explain it to somebody
Yeah, so
who's maybe never heard of it before?
a smart contract is basically a self-executing contract written in code.
Yeah.
So it's like a digital agreement
Okay.
that's stored and executed on a blockchain. So the terms of the agreement are written into the code, and then once certain conditions are met, the contract is automatically executed. So you don't need a third party, like a lawyer or a bank,
Right.
to enforce it. It just happens automatically on the blockchain.
So it's almost like those if this then that kind of
Exactly.
programs that people set up on their computers.
Yeah, it's a
if I get an email, then send a text or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So if this happens on the blockchain, then this other thing happens
Okay.
automatically.
Okay.
And that's what makes them so powerful.
So what are some real world applications of smart contracts? Because I feel like we're always talking about buying a house.
Yeah.
Or, these very high level kind of complex things.
Yeah, no, totally. There's actually a lot of really cool real world applications that are already being used.
Yeah.
So one example is supply chain management.
Oh, interesting.
So you can use smart contracts to track goods as they move through a supply chain.
Okay.
And you can even automate payments
Okay.
along the way. So for example, let's say you're importing coffee beans.
Right.
You could have a smart contract that automatically releases payment to the farmer when the beans are shipped,
Interesting.
and then another payment when they reach the port,
Okay.
and so on. So it just makes the whole process a lot more efficient and transparent.
That's so interesting. I mean, especially when you talk about supply chains, that's always something that people are worried about is transparency,
Yeah, okay.
where things are coming from. And so to be able to kind of automate that and have it all
Yeah.
recorded on the blockchain, I feel like that's a huge.
Yeah, and you can even track things like ethical sourcing or
Yeah.
sustainability practices.
Wow.
So it's not just about the movement of goods, but also about ensuring that they're being produced in a responsible way.
So what are some other kind of industries where you think this could be really transformative?
Yeah. So another really interesting application is in voting systems. So you can imagine a system where votes are cast and counted using smart contracts on a blockchain, and that would make it much more difficult to tamper with the votes
Oh, wow.
because it's all recorded on a public and immutable ledger. And that's something that a lot of people are really excited about.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that is a big concern that people have. And obviously with, elections coming up next year.
Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like that's a huge.
That's a hot topic for
Yeah. What about other industries? I mean, you mentioned supply chain. We talked about voting a little bit.
Yeah, well, another area where they have a lot of potential is in digital identity verification. So you can imagine using smart contracts to store and manage our digital identities securely on a blockchain. And that would give us more control over our personal data.
Right.
And it would make it much harder for someone to steal our identity.
That is really interesting. I feel like there's so much potential here. It's kind of mind-blowing. But I do have to ask, what about the downsides?
Yeah.
These things sound almost too good to be true.
Right. Yeah.
Is there anything we should be concerned about?
Definitely. So one of the biggest concerns with smart contracts is security. Because the code is immutable.
Right.
Once it's deployed on the blockchain, it's very difficult to change.
Yeah.
So if there's a bug in the code, it can be very difficult to fix. And that can have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a lot of money or sensitive data involved.
So it's really important to make sure that the code is rock solid before it gets deployed.
Rigorous testing and security audits are essential.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's why I think we're not seeing smart contracts being used more widely yet.
Okay.
Because it is a really complex process to develop and deploy them securely. But, as the technology matures and we get better at writing secure code, I think we're going to see a lot more applications of smart contracts in the future.
I feel like what you were saying about security, though, makes me think of something else that's in this article, which is this idea that, blockchains are really good for transparency.
Yeah.
But they can also be really good for privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. That's an interesting point. So when we talk about transparency on a blockchain, we're talking about the fact that all the transactions are recorded publicly and permanently. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone can see all the details of those transactions.
Right. Okay.
There are ways to use cryptography.
Oh, okay.
To protect sensitive information. So you can have a smart contract that executes a transaction.
Okay.
But only certain authorized parties can see the details of that transaction.
So it's like it's still happening on the blockchain and there's still a record of it.
Exactly.
But not everybody has access to it.
Right. And that's really important for things like financial transactions or healthcare data where privacy is really important.
Yeah, for sure.
So blockchains can be both transparent and private.
So that kind of leads me to my last question, which is, we talked about all these different applications for smart contracts, but what do you think is the biggest challenge facing this technology right now?
That's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges is scalability. So as more and more people start using blockchains, the number of transactions that need to be processed increases, and that can slow down the network. And that can be a problem for smart contracts because if the network is slow, it can take a long time for a smart contract to execute.
Oh, okay.
And that can limit their usefulness. Yeah. So I think finding ways to scale blockchains so that they can handle more transactions more quickly is going to be really important for the future of smart contracts.
It's fascinating, though. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about this technology. And like you were saying,
absolutely,
it has the potential to revolutionize so many different industries.
I agree.
So any final thoughts for our listeners out there?
Yeah. I think the main thing I want people to take away from this is that smart contracts are really a game changer. They have the potential to change the way we interact with each other and the way we do business.
Totally.
So I encourage everyone to learn more about them and to start thinking about how they could be used to solve problems in their own lives or in their own industries.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be the next big innovator in the smart contract space.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. This was a really fascinating conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, we'll see you next time. Smart